Keanu Reeves had chosen the neighborhood for one simple reason: peace. Tucked away behind rows of identical houses and trimmed lawns, it was the kind of place where nobody asked questions and everybody followed the same unspoken rhythm. Keanu fit right in, not as a movie star, not as a headline, but as the quiet man who waved politely, walked instead of drove whenever he could, and kept his head down. Most neighbors knew him only as that nice guy on the corner, the one who returned misdelivered mail and helped carry groceries without expecting thanks. He lived simply, dressed plainly, and never once hinted at the life he lived beyond those HOA-controlled streets. To him, anonymity wasn't an escape, it was a gift. It started with a small observation. Keanu noticed children sitting on the curb after school, scrolling phones, waiting for parents stuck in traffic. He noticed an elderly woman walking past his house twice a week to reach the bus stop, pausing every time to catch her breath. He noticed how the nearest public library was miles away, inaccessible to kids without rides and seniors without energy. One weekend, quietly and without telling anyone, Keanu built a small wooden box near his front fence. He painted it a soft blue, added a glass door, and stocked it with books he personally selected. Children's stories, large print novels, self-help books, poetry, even a few dog-eared classics that had once helped him through dark times. A hand-painted sign hung above it, simple and sincere: free community library, take one, leave one. At first, people approached cautiously. A young boy was the first to open the door, his backpack sagging as he pulled out a worn adventure novel. A mother followed, then another. Soon, neighbors began stopping by daily. Parents sat on the curb reading with their kids. Teenagers swapped comics. Seniors lingered longer than necessary, flipping pages just to feel connected again. Some left-hand-written notes tucked between the books. Asterisk, thank you for this asterisk. My son finished his first book today. You don't know how much this means. Keanu never stood nearby to watch. He'd glance from his porch, smile faintly, and step back inside, content knowing something good existed quietly, without his name attached to it. But kindness doesn't go unnoticed, not always by the right people. On a crisp Monday morning, Keanu stepped outside with a mug of coffee and froze. Taped directly onto the glass door of the library was a neon orange notice, impossible to miss. The bold black letters read, HOA violation, unauthorized structure. The paper fluttered slightly in the breeze, as if mocking the books behind it. According to the notice, the library violated community standards, obstructed uniform landscaping, and encouraged unnecessary gathering. The HOA demanded its immediate removal within 48 hours or daily fines would begin. No conversation, no warning, just authority, stamped and signed. Keanu stood there longer than anyone expected him to. He didn't tear the notice down. He didn't argue with a neighbor or make a phone call. He simply read every word carefully, folded the paper neatly, and placed it in his jacket pocket. Across the street, a few neighbors peeked through curtains, their faces tight with concern. A young mother whispered, "Are they really making him remove it?" The elderly woman at the bus stop shook her head slowly, disappointment written deep into her expression. That small wooden box had become more than a library. It was a symbol of something the HOA rules couldn't measure. And as Keanu turned back toward his front door, calm and unreadable, one thing was certain: the HOA thought they were enforcing a rule. They had no idea they had just started a battle they couldn't win. The HOA meeting room was never meant for confrontation, yet that night it felt like a courtroom without a judge. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sterile glow across a long folding table where 5 board members sat in stiff-backed chairs. Framed notices about lawn height and trash bin schedules lined the walls like commandments. Keanu Reeves arrived early, dressed simply in a dark jacket and worn boots, taking a seat at the back without drawing attention. A few neighbors filtered in behind him, parents, retirees, a couple of teenagers, drawn there not by rule violations but by quiet loyalty. When the meeting began, the HOA president cleared her throat sharply and wasted no time. "We're here to address an unauthorized structure that violates community standards," she announced, tapping her pen against a clipboard. She never once used the word library. The accusations came quickly and without warmth. The board claimed the wooden box encouraged loitering, disrupted visual uniformity, and posed a liability risk. One member scoffed openly, saying, "This isn't a charity zone. If everyone starts putting up personal projects, we'll have chaos." Another rolled his eyes and added, "Good intentions don't override bylaws." Keanu listened, hands folded, expression calm. When invited to speak, he stood slowly, his voice low and steady. He explained that the library was non-commercial, temporary if required, and intended only to serve neighbors who lacked access to books. He offered to adjust its placement or appearance to comply with guidelines. The room went silent for a moment. Then the president interrupted. "This board has already decided," she said flatly. "The structure must be removed within 48 hours. Daily fines will apply after that." Murmurs rippled through the audience. A mother stood up, her voice shaking as she spoke about her son reading for the first time because of that library. A retired veteran followed, explaining how he visited it every morning to feel less alone. The board members stared forward, unmoved. "This meeting is not a public forum," the president snapped. "Please sit down." When the room settled again, Keanu asked a single question, measured and polite. "May I have a written explanation citing the exact bylaw this violates?" The president hesitated, then nodded curtly. "You'll receive documentation," she said. "But the deadline stands." The message was clear. This was not about compromise. It was about control. After the meeting, board members clustered together, whispering with thin smiles. One of them glanced at Keanu and muttered, "People love attention stunts." Another laughed softly. They assumed compliance would follow. Outside, neighbors gathered around Keanu, apologizing as if they were somehow responsible. He reassured them gently, thanking them for coming, telling them to go home. "It's okay," he said. "Let's see what the paperwork says." Later that night, an email arrived from the HOA's official address, formal, cold, and unmistakably threatening. It listed fines, removal costs, and vague references to further action. No citations, no legal grounding, just authority asserted as fact. Keanu read the email twice, then opened a folder on his desk labeled simply Community Library. Inside were printed city ordinances, photos of similar libraries across town, and correspondence from local nonprofits. He added the HOA notice and email to the folder, aligning them neatly. There was no anger in his movements, no dramatic reaction. Instead, there was intention. Somewhere between that sterile meeting room and the quiet of his home office, the tone had shifted. The HOA believed they were issuing an ultimatum. Keanu understood something they didn't. Ultimatums only work when the other side has no options, and he had already begun preparing his response. The letter didn't look dramatic. There was no heavy parchment, no bold red ink, no threat-laced language meant to intimidate. It was clean, precise, and quietly devastating. 3 pages, neatly formatted, sent by certified mail and email at the same time. Keanu Reeves reviewed it one last time at his kitchen table, morning light spilling across the wood grain as steam curled from an untouched cup of coffee. Every sentence had been chosen with care. The tone was respectful, almost gentle, yet anchored firmly in law. It acknowledged the HOA's authority, then methodically outlined the boundaries of that authority, boundaries the board had already crossed. When Keanu signed his name at the bottom, it wasn't as a celebrity or a homeowner desperate to win an argument. It was as a resident asserting his rights, calmly and completely. The letter cited city ordinances that explicitly protected small, non-commercial community structures like free libraries, labeling them as expressions of community engagement rather than permanent installations. It referenced state-level free speech protections, noting that the library's purpose, sharing literature without profit, placed it under safeguarded expressive conduct. It went further, pointing out accessibility considerations the HOA had ignored. The nearest public library's distance, the lack of safe sidewalks, and how the community library improved access for children and seniors alike. Finally, the letter requested something simple yet powerful, a written response identifying the precise bylaw violated, along with documentation proving the HOA's authority to enforce removal under municipal law. There were no ultimatums in Keanu's words. Just clarity. The HOA board didn't respond. 2 days passed. Then 3. The 48-hour deadline expired, but the library still stood. No fines appeared. No enforcement arrived. Instead, something else happened. A city zoning officer knocked on Keanu's door, followed by a representative from a local cultural affairs department. They weren't there to reprimand him. They were there because the letter had been forwarded internally after raising questions the city couldn't ignore. The officials examined the library, took photos, and reviewed the HOA notice with raised eyebrows. "This doesn't appear to violate any city code," one of them said plainly. "In fact, we encourage these." By the end of the visit, the officers left with copies of the HOA correspondence and a growing concern about the board's overreach. Word traveled fast, though Keanu never spread it himself. A neighbor posted a photo online, not of Keanu, but of the library and the violation notice still taped to its door. Local community groups shared it. Then a reporter called, asking why an HOA would target a free library in a city that celebrated them. The HOA president finally responded to Keanu's letter with a short, defensive email insisting the board had full discretionary power. That email would later become important. Lawyers noticed it. So did the city. It contradicted municipal guidelines and hinted at a pattern of enforcement that hadn't been legally reviewed in years. By the end of the week, the library was no longer the issue. The issue was the HOA. City officials requested records, past violation notices, fine structures, election procedures, financial reports. The board scrambled, suddenly aware that their silence had been a mistake. Keanu, meanwhile, said nothing publicly. He didn't give interviews or statements. He didn't celebrate. He simply kept the library stocked, replacing a children's book that went missing and adding a new large print novel for the elderly woman who now stopped by every afternoon. The letter had done exactly what it was meant to do. Not provoke a fight, but expose one. And the HOA was only just beginning to understand the consequences of underestimating a man who believed that calm, when paired with truth, could be far more powerful than force. The first news van arrived just after sunrise, its satellite dish unfolding like a mechanical wing as it parked across from Keanu's house. By mid-morning, 2 more followed. Reporters stood on the sidewalk, microphones in hand, carefully framing shots that showed the small wooden library in the background. The story wasn't Keanu Reeves. It was the idea that a neighborhood HOA had tried to erase something so universally good. City officials returned as well, this time in larger numbers, clipboards replaced by tablets and formal badges. They walked the streets slowly, documenting signage, landscaping changes, and past violations posted on other homes. The atmosphere shifted from neighborhood dispute to official review. Residents watched from porches, realizing this was no longer a private matter. Inside the HOA office, panic replaced confidence. Board members who had once spoken with certainty now spoke in hushed tones. Files were pulled from cabinets that hadn't been opened in years. As city investigators requested financial records, a pattern began to emerge. Fines issued without proper notice, selective enforcement against certain residents, and funds allocated without transparent approval. One investigator paused over a spreadsheet, pointing out inconsistencies that suggested money meant for community improvements had been redirected to administrative expenses. The HOA president attempted to justify the actions as standard procedure, but her voice lacked conviction. For the first time, the board realized this wasn't about a library at all. It was about accountability. The community meeting that followed was nothing like the one before. This time, the room was full. Neighbors who had never attended an HOA gathering lined the walls, some standing on chairs just to listen. A city representative explained that enforcement actions were being temporarily suspended pending review. When residents were invited to speak, the stories poured out. Elderly homeowners fined for minor repairs, families charged excessive penalties without appeals, and projects denied without explanation. Each account added weight to the investigation. Keanu sat quietly near the back, eyes lowered, allowing others to speak. He didn't need the floor. His presence alone was enough to remind everyone how this had started. By the end of the week, the HOA's authority was effectively frozen. The president received formal notice requiring her resignation during the investigation, and 2 board members stepped down voluntarily. The city announced a full audit, citing credible evidence of systemic overreach. Outside, cameras captured the moment the HOA sign at the entrance of the neighborhood was covered with a temporary city notice declaring enforcement suspended. Neighbors applauded softly, not in triumph, but in relief. For years, many had felt powerless. Now, for the first time, someone had pushed back, and done so without anger, without spectacle. Keanu returned home that evening to find the library surrounded by people. Not reporters this time, but families. Children sat cross-legged on the grass, reading aloud. The elderly woman smiled as she placed a bookmark between pages. Someone had added a small vase of flowers on top of the library, another a handwritten sign that read, "This belongs to all of us." Keanu watched from a distance, hands in his pockets, the faintest smile crossing his face. The HOA had thought they were dealing with a rule breaker. What they had actually confronted was a reminder of something far more dangerous to unchecked power, a community willing to stand together, and a man who understood that the strongest response to injustice is patience, persistence, and the courage to let the truth speak for itself. The final decision didn't arrive with a gavel slam or a dramatic courtroom speech. It came quietly, folded into a formal city bulletin posted online late on a Friday afternoon. After weeks of audits, interviews, and document reviews, the conclusion was clear. The HOA had exceeded its authority, violated municipal codes, and misused resident funds. Enforcement powers were permanently revoked until new elections could be held under direct city oversight. Fines issued over the past 3 years were declared invalid, with refunds ordered immediately. For most neighborhoods, that would have been the end of the story, a clean legal victory, a satisfying correction. But this wasn't just any neighborhood, and Keanu Reeves wasn't interested in simply winning. At a final public meeting, the former HOA board members sat stiffly as the city representative read out the required remedies. Among them was a formal written apology to be delivered to every resident, specifically acknowledging the improper attempt to remove the free community library. Cameras captured the moment, but Keanu didn't look at them. When invited to speak, he stood slowly, hands relaxed at his sides. His voice was calm, almost understated. He thanked the city officials, then the neighbors, emphasizing that the issue was never about him. This was about access, he said. About kindness being treated like a violation. He declined compensation for legal costs, announcing instead that any awarded fees would be redirected toward community programs. The room fell silent, not from shock, but from respect. Within days, construction began, not just in that neighborhood, but across the city. 12 new free community libraries were installed in areas identified as book deserts, each one built in partnership with local schools and nonprofits. They varied in color and design, reflecting the neighborhoods they served, but all carried the same small plaque. Take a book. Leave a book. Leave the world a little better. Keanu visited none of the ribbon cuttings. He asked that his name be kept off the announcements. Still, people knew. They always do. Parents shared photos of their children reading for the first time. Seniors gathered around the boxes, trading recommendations like old friends. What had started as a single wooden box by a fence had become a citywide movement. Back in the original neighborhood, the library remained exactly where it had always been. The orange violation notice was gone, replaced by a laminated city certificate recognizing it as a protected community resource. The HOA sign at the entrance was eventually removed altogether, replaced with a modest plaque welcoming residents and visitors alike. Without the constant threat of fines and warnings, the neighborhood changed in subtle ways. People lingered longer outside. Conversations lasted past sunset. Trust, once eroded, slowly returned. And at the center of it all stood the library, still modest, still free, still quietly doing its job. One evening, long after the cameras had left and the headlines had faded, Keanu walked past the library as a child carefully slid a book back onto the shelf. The child looked up and smiled, unaware of who he was or what he had done. Keanu nodded back and continued down the sidewalk, disappearing into the soft glow of streetlights. There was no grand finale, no speech, no applause. Just a neighborhood transformed, a lesson learned, and a reminder that the most powerful victories aren't about defeating an enemy. They're about proving that compassion, when defended with patience and principle, can outlast any rule designed to suppress it.